Hello, I'm Matthew Jarron, Museum Curator at the University of Dundee, and welcome to the latest in a series of short films in which I talk about some of the highlights of the university's museum collections. And today we're going to be looking at an interesting collection of art and design objects held by the School of Dentistry. Now we have various collections in the dental school, some of which you might expect. So we have a lot of early instruments, for example, dental tools. We also have a fantastic collection of comparative anatomy of animal teeth and jaws. But what you might not expect is that the school also has some really interesting paintings, sculpture and glass objects. And the reason that we have those is that the first two chairs of the dental hospital and school were both very notable Dundee art collectors. Now, there's quite a tradition in Dundee of dentists being interested in art. In fact, in the late 19th and early 20th century, three of the most notable art collectors in Dundee were dentists: A.B. Spence, John Stewart and John Robertson. And we certainly know that Robertson actually showed his collection of art on the walls of the waiting room in his surgery so that patients could hopefully feel a bit more relaxed while waiting for their appointments by looking at all this lovely art. Now, most of the city's dentists were members of the Dundee Dental Club, and it was the club that really started the Dundee Dental Hospital in 1914 in a couple of rooms in Park Place at number 4, with an associated dispensary next door at number 6. The dental school then followed 2 years afterwards, and in 1917 Graham Campbell was appointed as the first Dean and Advisor of Studies. And the school was affiliated to University College Dundee, at that time part of the University of St Andrews. And that relationship between the dental hospital, the dental school and the university was unique in Scotland. It was the first time that it had happened, and indeed for over 30 years it would remain the only institution of its kind in Scotland. Other dental schools in Edinburgh and Glasgow being affiliated not to universities but to surgical colleges. Now, demand for the dental hospital quickly outstripped the available resources, and in 1918 the hospital moved to much larger premises at number 2 Park Place, which had been paid for and equipped by the chair of the dental hospital and school, William Retty. Now, Retty was a grocer by trade, and in 1885 he entered into partnership with another grocer, William Lowe, at just the time that his business was rapidly expanding. And of course, William Lowe ultimately would become the largest supermarket chain in Scotland. But Retty was also a very keen art collector. Now, we don't know a huge amount about what he collected because, unlike some of the other collectors at the time, he very rarely lent his art to public exhibitions. But one of the most notable features which Retty had installed in the new dental hospital was this stunning stained glass window. And this was created, and indeed the whole hospital was endowed, as a memorial to Retty's son Philip, who was killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme during the Great War. Now, the window was made by the Edinburgh company, Ballantyne and Sons, and we think was designed by Lieutenant James Ballantyne, who was one of the members of the family who was actually also fighting in the war at the time. Now, Retty did a huge amount to establish the success of the dental hospital and the dental school. Sadly, he died in 1922, and his successor, William Boyd, paid for another stained glass window to be added as a memorial to him. Now, this piece is very different to the War Memorial one. It was made by Douglas Strawn, one of the most notable of stained glass designers in Scotland at the time, and was actually one of 6 panels that he designed for the Scottish National War Memorial at Edinburgh Castle, but this one was never actually used. It's a scene from Revelations featuring peace and tranquility triumphing over the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, the same year that Retty had become a partner with William Lowe, he actually married Lowe's sister, Annie. And after Retty's death, Annie Retty continued her involvement with the dental hospital and school. She had a particular interest in glass, and sometime in the 1930s she donated 3 beautiful pieces of Monart glass to the hospital. So Monart glass was made by the Perth-based John Moncrieff Limited, and these pieces were designed by their top designers Salvador Isart, we think made around about 1929, 1930. So there are 2 vases and a bowl. And to mark their appreciation of everything that Mrs. Retty did for the hospital and school, in 1936 the board commissioned the very notable sculptor Benno Schatz to create this bust of her, which was presented to her, but she then presented it back to the hospital to be displayed there, as it still is today. Now that piece was also paid for by Retty's successor as chair of the Dental Hospital and School, William Boyd. So here is Boyd in the music room of his home Claremont in West Ferry, and you can see two Monets on the wall, and I think that's a Peplo in between them. And Boyd made his money as the director of Keeler's, the famous Dundee jam and marmalade company. And in fact, it was Boyd who ultimately sold the company off in 1924 to Cross and Blackwell, ultimately, of course, leading to the end of one of Dundee's famous 3Js. But it made a lot of money for Boyd, and he spent quite a lot of his money on buying art. And whereas we don't know a huge amount about Retty's art collection, we do know a lot about Boyd's. So we know he was very keen on Scottish art, and for example he was a major patron of the famous Dundee colourist John McLaughlin Milne, paying for him to spend his time painting in the south of France. He was also the first Scottish patron of the Scottish-based but Estonian-born sculptor Benno Schatz, which is why Schatz, of course, was commissioned to sculpt the bust of Mrs. Retty. And we also have another bust by Schatz of William Boyd himself. Again, this was presented to Boyd, but then gifted by Boyd back to the hospital. But Boyd also had much more radical tastes, and in particular he was very interested in modern French painting. So we know that he was the first person in Scotland to buy a Matisse, for example. The painting is now actually in the Tate collection. And he actually owned more Van Goghs than anybody else in Scotland. But extraordinarily, in 1936, Boyd actually sold one of his Van Goghs in order to endow the first chair of dental surgery at the university. Now at the time, Van Gogh was still massively out of fashion, and so he only got £2,000 of the £17,500 that he needed to actually endow the chair. The person who was appointed to that chair was H. Gordon Campbell, who was the brother of Graham Campbell, the first dean of the dental school, and indeed Gordon succeeded him as dean in 1938. Boyd also gifted this spectacular William McTaggart seascape called Summer Sea to the dental hospital. It was painted in 1907 and had actually previously belonged to another very notable Dundee art collector, I.J. Weinberg. Now McTaggart was much more fashionable at the time than Van Gogh was, so there's a distinct possibility that Boyd would have actually got far more money if he'd actually sold the McTaggart and gifted the Van Gogh to the hospital. So it does raise this interesting possibility that we might have had a Van Gogh on the hospital wall instead of the McTaggart. But it's a very lovely McTaggart, so we're delighted to have it. It now hangs in the waiting room of the hospital, but originally it was in the main entrance, as you can see here. And Boyd also paid for the various other portraits that we have in the collection. So there are actually two of Graham Campbell, the first from 1934, when he was appointed president of the British Dental Association, and the second from 1938, at the time that he retired as dean. And in 1939, Boyd commissioned Mackintosh Patrick to paint this portrait of Gordon Campbell to mark his taking up the first chair of dental surgery. Boyd died in 1941, and that really brought to an end the school's active collecting of art. But of course, the school and the hospital continued to expand over the years, most notably in the 1960s when the massive dental tower was constructed. And all of these various works of art are still on display in the hospital and the school today. And so we should be thankful to both Retty and to Boyd for their shared interest in beautiful art and beautiful smiles. And that's it from me. Hope you found that interesting. Look out for another film coming soon. Bye for now.